If you're a frequent listener to the broadcast that Jason Black and I do together, then you already know that the United Nations this week issued a report declaring that the United States owes Black Americans reparations. I expected it to be something of a mixed bag, but there were some good things in the report, like the part where it accuses the United States of racial terrorism. Now, none of this report is binding, and there's certainly no force behind it. This is the UN, after all. However, this research paper is interesting because of its admissions. But don't expect to see Hillary Clinton referencing this report during the campaign, or even after she could become president, because the report criticizes specifically certain Clinton-era legislation, such as 3 strikes and mandatory sentencing guidelines. However, like Hillary did in her debate with Trump, the report tried to limit the scope of the damage that the Clinton-era laws did to us as being only collateral damage, instead of the deliberate, massive damage that it truly was. The same wording that Hillary Clinton used. Well, the report was written by white people. Even when they get it right, they still get it wrong. Look, the report is hardly a panacea. Not at all. However, it is a nice kick in the throat to the dominant society at a time where their vicious animal behavior is on full display to the disgust of the world, and they're being challenged on multiple fronts in their own home by us. As one blog put it, reparations is now within the realm of politically acceptable speech. And the source of the criticism is also telling. As you know, white supremacy depends upon a fiercely enforced code of no snitching. So, for this UN report to accuse the US of terrorism, I think actually does say something. I find it nice to see the quote that the dangerous ideology of white supremacy inhibits social cohesion amongst the US population. Well, there you have it. The UN admitting that white supremacy is indeed a factor, if not the dominant factor, in the social dynamic. I wasn't expecting the report to go full black first, and it didn't, but as a conversation piece, I think it works. The white media has certainly been trying to find a way to spin this one. The propaganda arm of white supremacy has been working overtime, throwing shade at this report. They can't say that it's inaccurate, so instead they've been trying to see if they can raise some doubts as to the necessity of the report. Realizing that this is the latest in a flood of pressure coming at them from all sides, the dominant society is trying to use their media monopoly to question the basis of the report. Should the U.S. pay slavery reparations? Now, they never ask if the U.S. should pay money to Jews, even though the Holocaust happened in Europe and not the U.S., and the white trash who opposed slavery reparations said nothing when Native Americans get tax-free status and reparations, even though there hasn't been anyone alive who was part of the Native American genocide in nearly 80 years. Never mind the fact that many of the Native American tribes were not only collaborators in the European invasion, but also in the slave trade itself. The UN report tried every trick to limit the scope of what damages the U.S. would owe Black Americans for. The report tries to stick strictly to the aspect of wage compensation, and even then it only starts the meter running at 1787, the year the Constitution was ratified. This totally ignores the first slaves having been brought to the colonies in 1619, which was when North American slavery began. Officially, anyway. But even were we to expand the scope of slavery to its proper dimensions, it would still be insufficient, because slavery did not merely disadvantage Black people in terms of pay for their labor. It also disadvantaged Black Americans in terms of the formal opportunities that we were shut out of, and the benefits we could have derived from them for the first 350 years of the country's history. African Americans could only watch as their slave labor was used to build an empire whose spoils they have been systematically barred from accessing through the most ruthless, most relentless, violent campaign that the world has ever seen. Not only did the dominant society have the benefits of our labor, but at no point were they ever in danger of having to share it with the people who generated it in the first place. Slavery did not merely impoverish us, it enriched the white population of the U.S. Without our slave labor, there wouldn't have been a society worth coming to for all the wretched refuse of Europe. No one benefited from our uncompensated labor more than American industry and the American government, who derived all kinds of taxes and military might from the power of the economy. Yes, the rise of the United States economy was sudden and massive. But what white people refuse to admit to is that this was only possible because the white population was able to harness the massive natural resources of the Americas at virtually no cost. No matter what right-wing nuts try to say, everyone knows the most expensive aspect of running a business isn't taxes. If that was the case, then most U.S. businesses would be flocking to Ireland, where the taxes are low. Taxes are actually a moderate cost of doing business. The biggest single cost for any business is labor. People cost money to hire, cost money to keep on the payroll. Labor is not a tangible commodity. Worse than that, it's mobile. If you can get people to work for free, then you will literally have a license to print money, which is precisely what the peculiar institution benefited the U.S. with for the first 350 years of its history. Imagine the massive economic progress that is possible when you don't have to pay anyone. America built its economy on textiles. This was why, when we were confined to the plantations, they said cotton is king. Because slave plantations in the South produced cotton that went to the industrialists in the North who owned and ran the textile mills. Britain was the formerly dominant power in textiles, having built a large part of their empire on it, mostly through their colonization of India, but that was only possible so long as they had control of the colonies of North America. When Britain lost the colonies, not only had they lost the cotton and the resultant textiles, worse than that, they also lost the slave labor that produced so many other goods for them, such as sugar. So, when Britain claims to have abolished slavery in 1833, you can dismiss that for the lie it is. It was just that in 1833, the Brits finally gave up the ghost and abandoned any plans to edge their way back into the slave trade, which the American rebels had already locked them out of. This was why Britain could never compete with the newly independent United States in textiles. Britain had lots of broke, dirty peasants, but no resources. The U.S. had both the labor and the resources. As Dr. John Henrik Clarke taught, power requires that you control the resources and the means of production. And in controlling the cotton fields and the textile mills, the U.S. had a lock on both. The United States could underbid all the other European powers for textiles, and they did, because the U.S.'s most vital industry was being operated for free, and nobody can compete with free. Slavery was the only thing that made the U.S.'s rise to power possible. Without the free slave labor, you have no U.S. economy. No U.S. economy means no United States. How do you think the U.S. was able to pay for French and Dutch assistance? How do you think they were able to hire mercenaries? Both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were plantation owners, and they both wound up having to use their own personal money to pay the volunteers for the First Continental Army. So, the American Revolution was literally funded by black slave labor. Every penny that Washington and Jefferson put into the war effort came from the blood and toil of black people. There's a reason why the so-called American economic miracle was only possible here. It's because slavery alone made America possible. All the founders of the United States acknowledged that. The seditious traitors of the Confederacy reaffirmed this in 1861 as each of the redneck states wrote out their reason for secession, that they were determined not to lose the free money they were getting as the result of black slavery. Without the economy built on our black backs, there would have been nothing for the German immigrants to come here for. When the Irish came to escape the potato famine, they would have starved right here in the Americas, just like the first white people of Roanoke did, had it not been for us. It was black labor that built the superpower. It sure as hell wasn't Hillary Clinton's mythical, hard-working white people. The same goes for the Chinese who came in the late 19th century. Without slavery, there would have been no railroads for them to work on. The railroad magnates got their seed money from banks whose coffers had long since been filled with the ill-gotten gains produced by us, which we never got a penny of. The railroad barons used the railroads to move cotton. Same for the shipping industry. Cotton barges moved the produce of black labor to enrich the whites who lived in the U.S. and the ones who were on their way here. All the while, the United States government was reaping enormous profits in the form of taxes, experiencing seemingly unlimited double-digit growth that seemed to have no end. So much so that Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, was able to leverage the nation's debt against its projected earnings because the money rolling in from the cotton fields was so massive, the U.S. could afford to live well beyond its economic means. After all, when you're making more money than God from free labor, all you have to do is tell your creditors to put it on your tab. And as for the interest, well, interest is only a problem for poor countries. Other nations always had to factor in the enormous price of labor to support their industries, and it was all this free labor that paved the way for the Industrial Revolution. Eli Whitney's cotton gin is considered by most historians to be the birth of the Industrial Revolution. See, an economy cannot be looked at in monolithic terms. An economy is interconnected, like a spider web. A car manufacturing plant is not merely the plant itself, it is also the satellite businesses that service it, such as suppliers and distributors. It's the trucking and energy companies who increase business based on this microcosm of industry. Although cotton was the foundation of the U.S. economy, when it came time for the other downstream industries to come about, cotton was what made it possible to bootstrap those endeavors. Many of the robber barons were beneficiaries, even if only tangentially, from the slave trade. And we're not going to get into how the American banking industry bootstrapped itself from the slave trade. Any true tally of the cost of slavery must take into account how much the U.S. government and American business deprived us of, what they got out of it, because they didn't earn it, they stole it from us. The entire point of slavery was to get rich quick at the expense of innocent people. And so long as the thieves retain their stolen profit, we have not been made whole. Now, let's deal with a couple of fraudulent talking points that are being kicked around, which the dominant society invented and has clung to so as to deny responsibility for the greatest crime in human history. And allow me to say here that I don't mention slavery in the past tense. We allowed white people to get away with lying about what slavery was. We allowed Hollywood to miseducate entire generations about it. The reality of slavery, physical, its trappings as it has stood for 500 years has not changed. The black Americans who are alive today have the strongest case for slavery reparations of any generation. First, we must address the legal aspect of the talking points that are being used to try to debunk the case for reparations. The reason people have even thought that slavery was over was because we allowed the dominant society to get away with pushing a historical lie that slavery was abolished when it has never been. This lie is based upon the fraudulent premise that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery when in fact it did exactly the opposite. The 13th Amendment clarified the conditions under which black people were enslaved. It never abolished it. Here is what the 13th Amendment actually says. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. The key word there being except, which, as we all know, nullifies everything that comes before it in a sentence. If the 13th Amendment had been written honestly, what it would have said is, there shall be slavery and involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted. Now, the white supremacist weasels will try to claim that it refers to involuntary servitude. First of all, what was slavery if not involuntary servitude? Secondly, the 14th Amendment specifically addresses the inability of the state to deprive anyone of their liberty without due process. The 13th Amendment does not separate slavery from involuntary servitude because the law was written so as to link the two. And if you really want to get in-depth about it, how many black men are in jail right now for crimes that they didn't commit? Better yet, how many black men have been sitting there for years in many cases without ever having been convicted of a crime? Any way you slice it, both the letter and spirit of the 13th Amendment have been violated flagrantly by the white majority ever since 1865. The only thing the 13th Amendment did was to socialize the institution of slavery. Slavery passed from the hands of the private sector into the hands of the public sector. Black slave labor became a public good as the U.S. federal government, in plain writing, declared that black slavery was to be exclusively a state right. Read the thing. It says except as a punishment for crime, which is precisely how the state has used black slave labor ever since. Beginning with the chain gangs of the late 19th century. From there, in-prison labor camps. Today, Fortune 500 companies have entire prison factories. Most of the people working in them are black, working for no pay, to make rich white corporations even richer. The formerly private trappings of slavery and the control mechanisms created to support it all became governmental. The plantations were replaced by the projects. The cotton fields were replaced by the unskilled labor market. And the slave catchers were replaced by the police. The exact same societal structure that existed during slavery is still with us today. Black people everywhere are concentrated into small, impoverished quarters and are kept there, both by legal policies and through brutal social measures. Our movements, both as individuals and as a group, are closely monitored and controlled, particularly the movements of black men. You can be snatched off the streets at any time for no reason. This is why no one has been held accountable for the off-the-books prison facilities in Chicago, and they're not going to be. The city of Los Angeles imprisoned Michael Walker, an innocent man, for 2 years without so much as even charging him with a crime. And they were allowed to keep him locked up for those 2 years while they argued their case all the way up to the Supreme Court. This was a blatant violation of both the 6th and 14th Amendments. But that wasn't the reason that the Supreme Court denied Los Angeles' insistence to hold Walker without ever trying him. The Supreme Court simply said that Los Angeles could be held liable for withholding evidence, that Michael Walker, who has since died, was held for years without ever being charged, never came up in the Supreme Court's ruling because they understand that a slave cannot be illegally imprisoned. Black people are very quick to celebrate the one or two legal rulings that allegedly go our way without ever examining what these rulings actually say. None of them reference us as having had our constitutional rights violated. They all only mention some legal technicality that was violated, never our constitutional rights. How many black men are behind bars right now without charge, many in solitary confinement without trial? The man who allegedly beat up Dylan Roof was one of them. He had been locked up for 18 months without a trial. It was only the money that he got in donations that got him out. Black people are able to be paid for our work, but only for menial, tiny wages, which have to go back into the hands of the very same white people who gave it to us in the first place. And black people can be and are killed every single day by white race soldiers who the state has authorized to kill us with impunity. The daily slaughter of black people taking place is not happening in spite of the government, it is happening because of it. So you see, under the Constitution of the United States, slavery has never stopped being the law of the land. In any discussion of reparations, that is the very first point that must always be raised. This is, in part, the result of black people allowing the white majority to tell that lie and then indulge themselves with the lie. Every time that you claim slavery ended, you help to perpetuate their lie. Black people need to understand that it is not harmless when you echo the lies white people have told for hundreds of years. When you claim that we're free, what you're really saying is that white people stopped oppressing us when they have not. You provide them with rhetorical cover, which they use as a propaganda shield from behind which to deny responsibility for the crimes they committed and still commit, and to also launch their attacks upon us. After all, you can't say black people are being oppressed when so many of us claim that we're not. You can't claim slavery still exists when most black people themselves agree with the idea that it doesn't. Black people suffer from a type of schizophrenia where the subject of slavery is concerned. When Michael Brown is murdered, we'll claim that slavery is alive and well, and then the very next day claim that it's not. When white people are standing in front of us, we become bashful about the idea of slavery. But around one another, behind closed doors, suddenly slavery is back. You cannot have it both ways. Most black people know damned well that we are not free and have never felt that we are. But when white people come around, when they get in our faces, especially with a microphone, the Willie Lynch chip kicks in and we have only one impulse: to make sure white people are smiling when they're around us. Don't offend them in word or deed. And that usually starts with the issue of whether or not they've done us wrong. Worse than that, soon as they come around, we start trying to degrade ourselves to amuse them. I'm not mean to white people in general, believe it or not, but I am stern with them. I have a healthy disdain born from the understanding of the reality of the world I live in, one shaped and dominated by white supremacy, which they benefit from at my expense. Most black people are scared of white people, but mostly scared of not having their approval. This is the foundation of coonery. And make no mistake, cooning isn't about monetary benefits. Most black people who coon do it for free. To have white people laugh either with us or at us is its own reward. This pathetic need black people have to make white people feel comfortable around us at all costs will be the death of us, literally. and it will be justified by our own incompetent, irresponsible actions. Now, let's address another of the pathetic talking points that white supremacists try to use to defend the idea that reparations for slavery are not in order. The United States was economically and militarily supporting the European powers who were enslaving us. So the white lie about black people selling one another into bondage falls flat. That's not how slavery happened at all. The real way that it happened was Portuguese and Spanish barbarians killed Africans on the coast and set up imperial fortifications, later to be called slave forts. It was from these permanent land-based outposts that they headed inland and began to kill Africans there. Eventually, they made the same ultimatum to all the African societies that they encountered. Give us your land and your people, or die. If white people really want to claim that the European wasn't the sole perpetrator of slavery, then why is it that in all of the United States abductions of Africans, not once did they ever invite any of the African kings they encountered to the colonies of the U.S.? Why did they never set up any foreign legations with the African rulers they encountered? There's a reason why you never see any treaties or trade documents drawn up with the Africans. That's because there were none. White people were the ones who sold their in-laws into slavery. Britons sold their family members to the Scandinavians. Scandinavians sold Britons and their own Norse kin to the Arabs. And the Europeans were all selling the Slavic people to everyone. When white people tried that rhetorical misdirection about Africans were to blame for slavery, they're taking their own European corruption with other white people and attempting to project it onto us. If the Africans were so eager to sell one another into slavery to white people, then why did the Africans go to war with the Europeans when they invaded our lands? Why did the Africans continue to fight the Europeans afterwards? And why did not so much as one African ruler ever attempt to revive the slave trade? After the so-called end of slavery laws were passed, not so much as one African king, official, representative, or even African citizen has ever or had ever gone to the Europeans and offered them Africans as slave labor. Remember, slavery was allegedly abolished with the Europeans. Would have taken a while for the Africans to get the memo. Never mind the fact that the Europeans were still invading well into the 20th century. Wouldn't it make sense that if the whites were still flooding into Africa and the allegedly dirt-poor Africans had nothing to offer other than their labor, wouldn't they be begging white people to buy a few of them? Why is it that the Africans were not still trying to sell their brethren into slavery to the Europeans who showed up in the late 19th century, decades after slavery had allegedly been abolished? White people were and have always been the driving force behind the slave trade. The whites have never politely asked for anything. They put a gun to your head and rob you. That's how they got a foothold in the Americas. That's how they got the Mexican territories, how they got Hawaii, the Philippines, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They've never asked permission before they take millions of lives. Why would you be so silly as to think they did when they decided to take millions of laborers? There have been plenty of attempts by whites to place the blame for their actions on anyone but themselves. That's standard operating procedure for them, and we ought to be smarter than to believe it. You see what they do after race soldiers kill us in cold blood? It's always the black person's fault, no matter how blatant the white crime is. They want to claim that the Africans sold tens of millions of Africans, then tell the bastards to produce the receipts. Because we can show how the Africans arrived in the U.S., but it's funny how the whites can never produce any bills of sale. Slavers kidnapped the Africans. Lloyd's of London's, among many other insurance companies, insured the slave ships and their stolen cargo. Americans set up the slave markets where the people were sold. But notice how not one of them ever references any Africans who allegedly sold them other Africans in their business journals. No one mentions how King thus-and-so gave them a really good deal on Ghanaians this month. Slavery is the largest and worst single crime in human history, and the most well documented. And not only has this crime gone unpunished, it's also gone unfinished. We have not written the final chapter on slavery. The fight to end it still continues today. Some of you fell for the con job that it was over, but white supremacy is giving you a reality check now, aren't they? As we have always told you, eliminating us has always been the unfinished business of slavery. What you see happening in the streets today is only the thin end of the wedge. Their goal is to give us death by 10,000 cuts. Let them pull the slavery ended a long time ago con on someone else. In the real world, we know what slavery is, and we know that we are still in its grip today. Look, nobody is seriously saying that since the UN has tacitly acknowledged what we've been saying for centuries, that this somehow means the US is going to fall to its knees and beg forgiveness. White supremacy means never having to say you're sorry. Keeping black people in a subservient position until we've been effectively eliminated is official policy in the US, and it's the most important aspect of American society. However, this moment shouldn't be allowed to pass without at least acknowledging it. The United States is the single biggest criminal enterprise in human history. And its biggest crime was its first, the enslaving and continued enslavement of African people. I, for one, find it amusing that the U.S.'s international puppet has decided to talk back to its paymaster. Perhaps someone was moved by conscience. No, that's giving the Europeans too much credit. But perhaps they were looking at the Trump effect on this country and deciding that the red, white, and blue thug needs to be checked. Maybe it was just one guy who didn't get the memo. I don't think it's an accident that this report has been released at this moment. Either way, the fact that this happened at all is a feather in our cap. It's renewed the argument in a big way. And if for no other reason, it deserves to be discussed.